What's up, Las Vegas? We have our first ever educator in the building. I'm super excited for this. I'm here with Dr. Payal Sharma. She is an assistant professor in the business school. She is a qualitative researcher who studies power, leadership, and stress in organizations. How pertinent to Las Vegas. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Jake. I'm delighted to be here.
I know. I feel like we've recorded 3 different podcast episodes just from sitting here and talking on our handful of occasions.
Agreed. I feel the same.
The world is so fascinating. But yeah, thank you for coming on. I've been trying to find a way to talk with the different educators at UNLV. UNLV's been gradually increasing its status among the colleges in the United States. Is recently upgraded to a Research 1 facility. I know it gets a lot of flack, but sitting here talking with you, I know that it seems like there are a lot of important people there who are doing a lot of good work.
Thank you. It's interesting to be at the school because it is growing, and I feel like there's a path of ascension for UNLV, and there's so much opportunity for us as teachers and scholars, and there's more relationships being built with the community, including this podcast. So I'm honored to be at UNLV and really proud to call Vegas my home.
Oh yeah, it's such a beautiful place. Once you taste Vegas, you never ever leave, ever. But let's build some context, because I have this list here of all of these different things that you've been involved with, accolades, works that have been published. Give us a little 2-3 minute diagnosis of who Dr. Payal is.
Yes. I'm an organizational psychologist by training, and what that means is I study the psychology of work life. And much of my research is focused on relationships that people have in their organizations with their leaders, with other employees, and how those relationships can be handled. And so for me, my personal philosophy is that every day is a choice and involves a series of choices. So really what I love to study and talk about is how people can feel that they have choice and control in their work lives, especially when really hard situations arise. And as sort of some background information about me, I love to box. I do boot camp classes. I grew up listening to gangster rap. I have a neck tattoo. I try to really embody a lot of what my values are, which are about surrounding myself with experiences where I'm challenged, where I'm growing, where I have people who support me in my journey. And all of that really ties again back to this idea of where we have choice and control in our interactions inside and outside of our jobs.
So was there a specific moment growing up where you realized that you had this fascination with power dynamics?
Yeah, when I was a senior in college, I was a double major in Latin American history and anthropology. That was actually, I think, the earliest sort of seeds being planted of my interest in human behavior. And my history honors thesis was on a man named Subcomandante Marcos. He is a European man who wore a mask and led indigenous rebels in Chiapas, Mexico, in their fight for rights from the government. And I remember I would go to the library at UC San Diego. This is, of course, pre-technology and social media, the way we have it today. And I would spend hours in the library watching footage of him. And there was something romanticized, of course, about the mask wearing and this contrast of a light-skinned man leading dark-skinned rebels. But I knew how captivated I was by this idea of where people can find power, especially when, upon first glance, you would assume that indigenous people in Mexico have no access to any sort of resource. And so I really think that's where I started to understand that I would always want to study leadership and power and to help people, again, find their agency, especially in situations where you wouldn't expect that it's available.
Right. Power seems to have some subjectivity to it, because the power of the president is much different than the power of a CEO of an organization, but they both have drastic effects on the people who they lead to. And sometimes it tends to be a little bit more negative or a little bit more positive. How do you define power?
Yeah, it's such an important question. So power is typically defined in the research about the ability to enforce your will over other people. Now, when I teach about power dynamics in organizations, inevitably the conversation comes up with my students that power is a dirty word. And in some ways, rightfully so, because we know that when people have power, they abuse the power and they abuse other people. And I always like to joke in academic talks that power is like alcohol. And I can say this living, near the Strip, power makes us more of who we are. So if you want to know who someone is, what their character is like, give them power. It's definitely a revealing mechanism. So I always start with my students by expressing what power is and how it's defined. But then we have a broader conversation about what it means to actually use power and how power can in fact be used for good. So there was a research study done that showed if you have communal tendencies, so if you're focused on other people, when you have power, you're likely to use that power to help those around you. But if you're self-focused and you only care about your own interests, power is going to enhance that tendency even more. I always like to ask people, what are you like if you have power? If you don't have power, imagine you did. How would you use it? And I think that's really an opportunity then for us to redefine the conversation around power and maybe start to deconstruct the stigma of how it can be quite dirty. But I do think there's more to the conversation.
That's so funny that you say that, because a message I portray on here all the time is a similar idea with wealth. Wealth is just an accentuator of your personality. I've now hung out with a bunch of people who have massive amounts of wealth and no amounts of wealth. And if you're a negative person who has wealth, it doesn't really change you. You still have that same perception of reality, no matter what kind of resources that you have. And so it's really cool to hear you say that same idea with power, because now we see the amplification of wealth and power for some people, and it tends to go down a pretty dirty road, right? Like a lot of billionaires are now classified as like eat the rich, right? Most people are at least, I guess, depending on your political position, tend to give a negative stigma towards rich billionaires, right? Because now they have power and wealth.
Yes.
So it's very interesting to see how that dynamic rolls out. Do you think wealth and power tend to amplify each other together?
Yeah, I think we could say that wealth and power are correlated, and both of those can certainly, I think, bring out the worst in some people. And for me, so my background is I was at the Wharton School prior to UNLV, and some of your listeners may know the Wharton School is the #1 business school in the world. It's at the University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League community. And I came from a background where pedigree and education mattered. And on the East Coast, those are often drivers of connections and opportunities. But being in Vegas has actually really deconstructed how I view people. And I'm thankful for it, because you don't need wealth and you don't need power to feel powerful in your life. And so I feel like for me now, I'm starting to really understand more deeply that wealth and power can make you who you are, but you can still access power in other ways and allow who you are to come out in those other ways. So I'll give you an example. When I teach about power, I usually tell students there's 3 types of power. One is positional, and that's CEOs or leaders or the billionaires. They have authority, it's formal. The second type of power is relational or social. So it's who you know. And you've talked about how your network is your net worth. So that's one way to think about that. And the last type of power is personal. It's about your skills. It's about the value that you create. It's about what you uniquely possess and you can offer your organization that no one else can. So I feel like moving away from the power and wealth kind of categories hopefully starts to give people a sense of where they can access their own power and really become their authentic selves.
Wow. So yeah, your individual power is, I think, one of those categories that's on the rise. I think with the rise of the creator economy, where I say like COVID has kind of accelerated this trend of an e-commerce dominated economy. You see that these YouTube influencers, quote unquote, have a lot of power and they have a lot of sway. And also we're transitioning into an entrepreneurial driven world. Before it was more dominated, we'll say before the software revolution, it was more dominated by business owners, right? They had the ability to kind of hide behind their business and they're able to siphon money from their consumers. But now all the entrepreneurs are out there just like divulging themselves out in public. You can connect with any entrepreneur that you want. And I think that inherently seems to create more value because of their power dynamics. Or maybe it's like they're more of a self-belief in themselves, and maybe that gravitates people to like them a little bit more.
Yes, I agree with all of that. There's a really fantastic Audible called Lessons from Davos, the World Economic Forum. It's run by a former colleague of mine, Professor Adam Grant. So he basically had access to interview heads of states and countries around the world. But to your point, people started realizing that Davos was about people who had positional power and significant levels of it. But just because you're not at the table and you're not invited to be at the table doesn't mean that you can still create power. So people started creating their own sort of parallel activities to the World Economic Forum in Davos. So people would show up. They weren't in the limos or the black SUVs with the heads of states, but they were still networking on the side. And so I think entrepreneurial culture is one of the best representations of how you can create your own power. And, sometimes students will say, I don't know where to start. I don't know anyone important. That's not actually the starting point. The starting point is to ask yourself, what are your passions? What are your interests? Where can you create value for others? And then you build from there.
Yeah, actually, one of the first entrepreneurial endeavors that I did recently when I started the podcast, I wrote a guide. It's called the Not So Simple Guide to Discovering Your Own Niche. Because I believe that in order to be an entrepreneur, you have to look inside and figure out what you're good at and where to start. I had a lot of different trials and tribulations. I owned an antique store. I went down like a ticket verification route app, traded stocks and crypto. And at the end of the day, for me, I figured out that I just enjoyed communicating with people, and like that my conversations, I guess, had some sense of power where it could put me in front of other people. But there was no particular starting point. You just kind of have to go out there and do it. But,
yes.
But you have to understand like the kind of skills that you possess. And it's really almost like a catch-22, right? It's like we're taught to chase our purpose, but it's impossible to know your purpose until you understand where your niche is within society.
Yeah. And that process, as you've experienced, and I can say the same from my life and career, it's not linear. And it's not as though there's guaranteed wins along the way that will consistently happen. The process involves pleasure and pain, and that's how you figure out where your value added is. That's how you build your relational capital, as we say in the power research. And so that process of getting to know yourself, I think, is actually the gateway to gaining power. I'll also give you a tactical example. So something that intellectually drives me crazy is when people want to contact a CEO or, the head of a startup right away. Well, that person is probably getting a lot of asks on their time. Maybe strategically, you could step back and think about who's in their network, who might be people that work in their organization that you do have access to, and you could go to that person and talk about your value added, your skills, your interests, and you build incrementally in there. So power is not like a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a process that happens overnight. It takes an investment in yourself, and then it takes an investment in understanding how to play the game, is what we call it. And back to our earlier point, some people are uncomfortable when I say power is a game to be played in organizations and in life. There's a faculty member at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, Jeff Pfeffer, whose work has heavily influenced the way I think, the way I teach. And he says, if you're uncomfortable with the idea that life and organizations are a game, it's probably because you think life is fair and life is black and white. And if there's nothing your listeners take away from this podcast, it's the idea that life is not fair. We all know what the past year plus has been like to really amplify that. And life is messy. There are gray areas. So understand we don't all have the same starting points, but that doesn't mean that you still can't advance and still gain power in the ways we're describing.
It really is a game. It's a 4D chess in a sense. There was a word though that you talked about, relationship capital, because the term I use on here all the time is social equity. And so I think there's a lot of similarities there. And the way that I use it is that when I first started the podcast, people would approach me and they'd say, how are you going to monetize this? And I said, I am monetizing it. And they said, are you making any money? And I said, no. And they said, well, then what are you doing? And I said, every conversation that I have with a guest, I'm investing social capital into them and I get social equity in return. And then that is redeemed at some point in the future, whether it's a guest referral or a potential business partnership or anything along those lines. And it comes to the point that not everything has to be like fiat denominated dollar system. And I think that's also where power comes in, right? If you invest belief into somebody through a conversation and a relationship, that'll come back in magnitudes more of some sort of power. Is that kind of how the educational system views that the same, or research?
100%. And as you're talking, I keep thinking, I can't wait to host you as a guest speaker in my power class for my undergraduate students. Buzzwords associated with power include control, influence, and dependence. And what you're describing is the pathway to how you build influence in your community. So when you are involved in these asks with people, it sounds like you're cognizant of how to build that relationship. And then eventually you develop influence and leverage in those connections with that person and vice versa. So something controversial, I think, when I talk about power is you have power when people are dependent on you. But I actually think the most serving relationships in the business community are where there's mutual dependence. And I'm struck as you're talking that sounds like what you're creating is it's a win-win for both people. There's a woman in Silicon Valley named Hseih Roizen. We do a case study on her in my power class. And one of her fundamental sort of tenets in relationship building is that it has to be win-win. And she's actually quite mindful of how many times she has asks for people like a Bill Gates. She doesn't go to Bill Gates every day, obviously. But that win-win idea is actually how I think we should approach relationships. And again, as you're talking, I'm struck by how that's how you actually build social equity with people. Who wants to invest in someone who's always coming to them and asking and taking? If you can give and take, I think that's actually the hallmark of a relationship where power is mutually being developed.
Yeah, and it kind of goes in line with Vegas, the essence of Vegas, right? I like to call it an instant gratification town, or a what can you do for me now kind of town. There is investing, but it's a little bit more short-term social investing than long-term, right? A podcast would be a little bit more of the long game, whereas like hosts or bartenders or anybody, when they're communicating with their guests, they are investing some social capital, right? They're sitting there having a conversation with you, but you're being redeemed a tip instantly based off of how that investment went. So Vegas is beginning to grow outside of that a little bit, which is cool to see because you see some of the hosts. I'm just going to use what I'm familiar with. The hosts in the nightclub, they have continued returning clients, and they're also interested in like how the table service went for the night. They have to have the relationship with the servers and the bussers and the managers. So it's a city that's been built on a network, and it just is becoming more magnified now that it attracts so many tourists and people from all across the world because they love that and that enjoyment, because without having that relationship with the host, those clients wouldn't come to the nightclub, because our manager used to always say, Omnia, one of the most popular clubs in the world, will bring the guest in, but what keeps them coming back is you guys, the staff, the relationships.
Yeah. It's so fascinating to me whenever you talk about the nightlife. And as we've discussed, I'm exploring a new project on the host. From what you're describing in power language, it sounds like there's a transaction between a host and a customer, or a server and a customer, and that's very much resource driven, right? Money is exchanged for a service or an experience, but it sounds like the savvy hosts and the savvy servers have their eye on the long game, and they know that short-term transaction is sort of one drop in a puddle, and as you continue those interactions and you develop that longevity of the relationship, more resources come in, the guests come back, more money gets exchanged. And so I just think it's intellectually fascinating to me to think about how the short term matters, but really the long game is where people should be focused and really trying to curate that relationship so it's not just in the moment, but is a repeat experience.
Yeah, we would have guests come in consistently once a month, maybe every few weeks, depending on every time they come in town. There are some people who love Vegas so much, they're literally out here 15, 20 times a year. And they make sure that the relationship that they have with that server, they let them know they're in town and that they're coming to the nightclub. And it almost is like, to me, it's almost a catch-22, because I feel like they come in so much, they almost feel guilty if they don't come by because of that relationship that's been built.
Wow. I have a question then for you. How conscious or thoughtful do you think hosts are about some of these dynamics? Do they understand the importance of longevity? Do they understand that, yes, the money is important as a resource and it gives the host power, but really this is about a longer term relationship, not only in the moment?
Yeah, because they're also playing two sides of the coin, right? They're trying to build their clientele to be as big as it can so they can make as much money. but they're also building these relationships. They're cutting out the gatekeepers, right, to these millionaires and billionaires who are coming in town. But eventually they're going to want to do something outside of the nightlife. So they're going to want to build their own business or be a business partner with that money that they make. Some of these hosts are making, crazy number, $500,000 in a year, depending on the nightclub that they're working at, and can be maybe a little bit on each side of that. So they're making substantial money and they're building substantial relationships with these clients. And so it's interesting to see their point of view, but they're definitely aware of it. But they do have to put in 90 hours a week, 100 hours a week. They like to say like the host life is a lifestyle. It's not really a job because you're always on the call. I used to always make fun of the hosts every time they're walking in the back of house. They're always just head down, staring at their phone, walking, because they're just like constantly communicating. They probably get literally hundreds or thousands of texts a day from people.
Wow. And that means that the host and the guest have a mutual dependence that they share. They need each other.
Yeah. And it's strange too, because before I started working at the nightclub, I used to feel almost guilty hitting up hosts to get on the guest list, even though that's their job. But it's like there's almost like this pre-signed power that I've been like given to them without them even knowing who I am. And I'm just like a name or a number that comes up on their text. It's like they have like this clout because they are like they're like the gatekeepers into this mystical place that everyone wants to be at and where everyone spends $50,000 on table service.
So how does it not go to the host's head, or does it, all this power and control?
I think it does in some sense. I think generally there's some sort of like humbling moment where they realize like, yeah, my ego's getting a little far ahead of me, and maybe it turns away some of their clients. Maybe they can channel that ego to some sort of benefit. But I think they are generally aware of it, especially because some of the bussers or the servers or the management like lets them know.
Yeah. I've been told two statements about hosts that I've shared with you that, again, I find fascinating. One is that they control the strip. And two, the sort of most savvy hosts are those who understand that they can give up power and transfer it to a server, and then the hosts reclaim the power at a later point in the night or the interaction with the guest. And again, it's those hosts who understand they're working in a system, and there's actors, as we call it in the research world. And hosts who can leverage all the different actors are the ones that actually gain the most resources, i.e. money.
So before we had our conversation about a month ago when we started talking about this topic, did you even realize that this kind of thing was going on, or did you ever have any interest in the power dynamics of the strip that was right in your backyard?
I love this question. So as my bio indicates, I'm a qualitative researcher, which means I collect data primarily through listening to people's stories. I also do what we call field observations. So you go into the settings where you're doing your research. For a hip hop and rap music project, I went to a video shoot as an example, and also a strip club, which was one of my favorite experiences in my life, I have to say. There's no quicker way, by the way, to quiet an audience of academics than to say you've gone to a strip club for observations.
For science.
And then I always say to the academics, do you know what it means to make it rain? And it's, like blank stares. And then, of course, I have to mess with them a little. So then I say, do you know what it means to make it snow? And the blank stares just increase. And yeah, it's an awkwardly beautiful moment for me in my research career.
That's funny.
So to answer the question about did I know, the short answer is no, not at all. In qualitative research, we're often trained to look in our quote backyard to find research samples. And so literally because of you get 100% credit for this. When we talked about power dynamics in the industry about a month ago, that was like drinking from an overflowing faucet. And I took 2 pages of notes, Jake Gallen, after our conversation, and then texted the notes to 2 co-authors. We were early stage in our thinking. I'm like so nerdy. Like I cannot tell you how excited I am to study hosts and to have the access that's available in Las Vegas. I mean, through your generous offer and others I know, getting, participants or informants, as we call them, will be probably not a hard ask. And I just cannot tell you how delighted I am that this is a possibility. Some of my other research looks at masculinity in organizations. I've learned from you 99.9% of club hosts are male. So I just can't wait to get into this further. And Our academic journals are always interested in what they would consider more unique or kind of more extreme context. And the strip is certainly that, right? Where power and masculinity are at the forefront. So some of our plans include, my wish list, I should say, is for me to shadow a host one night at one of these clubs and just to experience firsthand kind of what they do, how they interact. I've been going out a little bit on the strip, and this is like embarrassing, but I stare at the club hosts just because I want to know more about their backgrounds. So I, again, feel it's a privilege to live here as a scholar and to know that there's this community that I can access to really tell a power story. My academic heart is beating happily.
Vegas is so unique because it seems like it's like an adult Disneyland in a sense. I used to always make the joke, you go to Disneyland and after about a day there, you're like, why am I here? I'm waiting in line 3 hours for everything. It's super expensive. Vegas is very similar, where I've seen like the perfect stay is like 3 days. Anything more than that, you just like are over it at some point. To get into some of these nightclubs, you could wait an hour, 2 hours if you don't have like table service. And that's just not just the nightclub. That's like restaurants and all kinds of things like that. And so it feels like this fictitious like fantasy land, but there's real money being made. And so that's also a running joke in the industry is like, oh, go get a real job. Like that's what people would tell us. But then it's like, when you realize the amount of money everyone's making, you're making more money than a doctor in some of these positions. So it's like, it's an exclusive fantasy land that is generating massive amounts of capital, but it just like, it doesn't seem real at points in time. It's so strange.
I couldn't agree with you more. I was reading an article yesterday about the 1 October shooting, and so much of what the article said surfaced for me what you have done today in this conversation already, but with other podcasts you've done. The Strip is a conglomerate of organizations at the end of the day. This is a series of businesses, right, that are running this town. And I feel like as an academic, my role and my responsibility and what I will gladly do in the minds of those who don't live here and academics who don't understand what it means to live and work in Las Vegas is to legitimize that organizational perspective. Power dynamics, leadership, stress, those again are at the forefront in our town. And I sometimes feel almost protective of Las Vegas when I talk to academics about the industries that seem more in the minds of people who don't live here, i.e. the Strip. Although, as we know, and you've mentioned in other podcasts, there's a tech sector, right? Zappos is here. There's a strong entrepreneurial culture. So there's a lot of other emerging markets, but very much so, the Strip is an organization and has all the forces that we study and talk about in a business school setting. And again, I'm happy to help people outside of Vegas understand the legitimacy of that. And as you've pointed out, this is not chump change, right? We're talking about $1 billion industry on the Strip. So gladly, I will drink from that overflowing faucet to study it and to teach about it and to show people that business really deserves a lens of respect to understand what's happening and the forces at play. And thank you, tourists, by the way, for no state income tax. Keep coming.
Vegas is like this social experiment that just like kept growing bigger and bigger, and you just like can't look away from it. And there's such a weird fascination with it. But you did mention that you studied masculinity. Also on the Strip that I've mentioned a lot is that I don't think the Strip would operate without the women of the Strip. I've used this example all the time. If all the men who worked on the Strip disappeared, I think the Strip would work fine. Tourists would still come, but if all the females disappeared, nobody would come, right?
Yes.
And so I think that women actually have like a strong power grasp on the Strip because they're also the ones who are divvying up the tips. When we work at the nightclub, the servers are the ones who decide on the tip out percentage, and they have a vote on it, and that's outside of the union protocols as well. So they really are like dictating the amount of money that can be made. What is your perspective on like the femininity of the Strip?
Yeah. And, I can talk about this a little bit from research I've done on video models in the rap game. And as your listeners probably know, video models are in videos, as their name suggests. They're not professional dancers. They're not choreographed. And I remember when I went to the strip club, this was on the East Coast, one of the big questions I get asked is who has power in a strip club? Is it the stripper or is it the customer? And I actually was led through research to watch a documentary that GQ did on Magic City in Atlanta. The title is something along the lines of, the club that runs hip hop. And so Future, the rapper, is in the video. They interview the manager of Magic City, who is also on my wish list of people to interview one day. And what they actually talk about is that power shifts in that relationship. So when we talk about women, for example, in these positions, the women are earning thousands of dollars, which is a resource in power language. And the documentary actually says that when rappers who have music that's coming out, so not like a Drake or someone who's already blown up, but rappers will often want strippers to dance to their songs, because if their songs get airplay in the strip club, that's how eventually those songs make it to the nightclub because of the network of DJs. So that's power that strippers have, right? In choosing the music that they're performing to. In other instances, I know why people say strippers have no power because of the nature of the work they're doing. Again, it's quite transactional, but I'm a big believer, if you're a woman and you understand power dynamics, you can make those power dynamics work in your favor, and you get to draw the line on morals and values. I'm no one's judge and jury on the choices that people make in their professional lives, but I certainly can understand and appreciate why women in a lot of ways are needed for the strip. You've mentioned in prior podcasts how the strip is hypersexualized, and there's a heteronormative culture, right, on the strip. So certainly those women, I think, can own and lean into their power in ways they're comfortable with. And if they are, again, acquiring a resource like money, then I think that's something that's important to think about. I always tell people that video models are the best power teachers I've ever met in my career. And I've hung out with CEOs and millionaires. They don't impress me the way the video models do when it comes to leveraging gender and power to their favor. One interesting finding from our research is that there's obviously stereotypes that video models are, bitches and hoes, and we can make a long list of the terms they're called. But the savvy video models are those who actually show up for shoots and they act professionally. They build relationships with the cinematographer, the lighting guy. They talk to the director about other employment opportunities. And so those women know how to play the power game, and they're winning at it. One of my favorite stories actually is when I was on set in Atlanta for a video shoot. One of the tech guys was telling me a story. So the tech guy was saying that the director of the shoot, we'll call him Michael for lack of a better name, Michael was sort of protective of a video model. Let's call her Jane. Michael ended up calling the crew of another video shoot where Jane had been hired. And Michael said to the crew, no one touches Jane. And touches obviously means no one screws with her, mistreatment, harassment, bullying, none of that's going down. And the tech guy was explicit in telling me over and over, he's like, Payal, you have to understand, Michael did not call his counterpart, the director on that video shoot. He called the tech crew because he knew that they would actually keep an eye out on her. Sure enough, when Jane went to that video shoot, no one messed with her. So that's a way where you acquire capital, you build a relationship. The video models are almost always women, but the guys control the game and the rap game. But she had this professional relationship with Michael, and he was looking out for her. And again, she wasn't messed with when she went to the other job.
Wow. Yeah. It's a smart way to do it. Similar to the servers who are building these relationships with the clients who come in and have a substantial amount of money. It's really just a way to fast track that relationship. As you were talking, I had this thought about a power move that women make on the strip, which is very common, which is getting breast implants, right? Because they're really leaning into that attraction, and that gains them a lot of money. I would say probably maybe 80% of the women that worked at Omnia had breast implants, and I think that's very common for not just the nightclub, but just like pretty much all positions on the strip. It seems to be a normative thing. I don't know if it's more so for a confidence boost. I know women generally get a confidence boost from that, but it's a very known idea that if you get breast implants, your sales will increase drastically. So that is would you consider that like a power move?
If we think back to the definition of power, it's to enforce your will over other people. And so if accentuating different parts of your body helps you earn more resources, then I could see how in power language that would make sense. I feel like if I isolated what they're doing as a power move, that again is logical and it's helping them acquire influence. They're actually understanding their customer base, right? In business language, they know what the needs are and they're able to exceed those needs probably in certain ways. I probably would be remiss if I didn't add, it's where it tips and starts to affect women's self-esteem or self-worth that I think the conversation becomes much more complex. So yes, it's a power move. And if women can separate that power move from seeking validation from other people and investing their own self-esteem in those transactions and that money acquisition, that's where I think it gets a little more tricky. But certainly I can understand why women acquire the resource of money they do when they, accentuate their bodies in the ways you're describing.
Yeah. And also the majority of them do it to get hired at these clubs, right? They have auditions. When I went to apply at Omnia, there was 2,000 bussers and 5,000 servers. They said applied. And so it's for maybe 60 positions of each. So there's fierce competitions, like less than 1% of the people are getting selected. And when you show up, the guys are in board shorts, no shirt, the women are in bikinis and they take pictures. So everyone's trying to edge each other out physically or superficially to get there. But then what keeps you there, I guess, is your mental stability or your salesmanship. So there's a few different ways to present yourself as being powerful physically, I guess.
For sure. I mean, your physical ability is a clear indicator of power, even in the research. Some people who are listening may be familiar with Amy Cuddy's work on power poses. So something that faculty at like Harvard Business School are taught is that when you teach MBAs, their crowd is pretty demanding there. You don't stay in sort of the circle at the front of the room. That's the designated like spot to lecture in. You walk around. And when a student in MBA asks you a question, as a faculty member, you're actually trained to go up to the student and stand right next to the student and make it almost this intimate space where you're dominating that space with your physical prowess. And faculty are not particularly big. A lot of them don't work out. Sorry, guys, you don't, but you don't. So certainly, yeah, how you carry yourself. Are you standing with, your chest out, your shoulders back? What is your posture like? Again, this is all on that physical component of power.
So I got to ask this, and it may be a touchy subject for a lot of people, but I know one of Donald Trump's power moves was that he was large in stature. He was 6'5", and that tends to be a common trait within presidents is that they're large. I also read a book about Donald Trump and power dynamics called Win Bigly by Scott Adams. Have you ever read that?
No.
It's literally like 200 pages about like the persuasion of Donald Trump and how he uses it to get what he wants. And he's actually like much more intelligent than he leads on to believe because of those power dynamics. I'm just curious on like your opinion of Trump, regardless of political affiliations.
Yes.
He seemed to have a lot of power. Even outside the office, he has a lot of power, and he seemed to be this like, what's up, YouTube? We're going to take a quick 60-second break to give a shout out to the first ever sponsor of the Guest List podcast, and it is none other than Manscaped. It's June. Summer is here. Fremont Street is packed. I was out the last 3 nights till 3 a.m. It felt like old Vegas. We're getting ready to go to the day clubs. And for one, as a man, we need to make sure that we are trimmed in the right areas. I'm a big fan of Manscaped. Like I said, I use the product. I'm happy that they came on to be a sponsor. But lucky for us, they just came out with a brand new product for us. And I'm going to read it off just so I don't mess up. From the legends who introduced the greatest electric ball hair trimmer ever, Manscaped is now introducing the Ultra Smooth Package, a razor and formulation kit designed for the brave men out there who like to go to the skin when they trim their balls. Your new nickname is going to be the Bald Eagle after using the Ultra Smooth Package. Here's a picture of it. Make sure you guys use the discount code, The Guest List. You're listening to The Guest List. Use the promo code, The Guest List. Very simple. You'll get 20% off and free shipping anywhere in the United States. If you're a fan of the show down here in Vegas, this is a must. So make sure you go to manscaped.com, use the code TheGuestList for 20% off and free shipping. Your balls will thank you. Now let's get back to the show. He seemed to be this figure that no one could figure out who he is, but everyone knows that he's just exuding power.
Yeah. I have a couple of thoughts, and I don't mind touchy subjects at all because I live in a world of unconventional research according to most traditional academic perspectives. So the way I can answer this is twofold. One, I heard a story where a photographer came to the White House and was photographing Trump, and I guess it was pure chaos. And so the photographer at one point finally said to Trump, like, how do you manage this? It seems like, there's so much frantic activity and there's just pure chaos. It's like being in the middle of a storm. And this is not verbatim how it happened, but you'll get the essence. Trump leans forward and says to the photographer, "I am the storm." Which I think is just telling in so many ways. So putting political orientations aside, the way that I like to think about Trump is akin to a survey that the New York Times Magazine administered in 2015. The question was to their readers, if you could go back and kill baby Hitler, would you do so? So I'll ask you, Jake, would you kill baby Hitler if you could?
Of course, yeah. As growing up with Jewish heritage too, I feel like I would have to.
Yeah. And in fact, the Holocaust is the number one reason why people say yes. And the results were about 40% said yes, about 30% said no of the readers, and then the other 30% or so were undecided. The Atlantic did an analysis of this question. And the reason I liken it back to Trump is that the conversation around killing baby Hitler is broadly about nature and nurture and why leaders emerge when they do. And so in my leadership class, we talk about whether leaders are born or made. Is it nature or is it nurture? And really where the research has led us is that there's an intersection, right? There's an interaction of who you are in the context or the timing of where you're living. Success and power, by the way, is also similar. People are not born successful usually. They might have access to like networks and resources. But I think leadership is a reflection of a person's individual differences, like their personality, and whether or not the setting they're in is ripe. So when I think about Trump purely from a leadership perspective, I think about contextually, this country, quote unquote, needed a leader like him. Of course, not everyone voted for him. 70 million people, I believe, did. So I think he was the right fit, for lack of a better word, for the time in which he rose to leadership. He led, whether or not you agree with him, but he led with more fear-based tactics, right? And for people whose lives might lack security or stability, that resonated with them. And so from a pure leadership perspective, he was influential. He was persuasive, as you mentioned. He had power. He could enforce his will over other people. Why? Look at the economic and social conditions of our country during the time that he was elected, during the time that he was in presidency. Why were people in favor of certain decisions he made? It's similar, again, to when you think about whether or not you would kill a baby Hitler. Hitler rose to power because the economic and social conditions at that time created almost fertile ground for his leadership. So my academic colleagues, sometimes struggle if they're not in favor of Trump of how he came to power. But when you step back and you actually look at it from a theoretical or research perspective, you understand again that the conditions were ripe for him to come to power in the ways that he did, for the style he communicated, for his personality, for his, orientations on X, Y, and Z topics. So I think it's, again, a lot more about the intersection of who he was and when he was leading.
Yeah, he was such an anomaly in terms of, I guess, just being quote unquote presidential. The book Win Bigly by Scott Adams. Scott Adams is the creator of Dilbert, the comic strip, but he's also a big philosopher, and he has a heavy background in hypnosis. And he talks about like some of these like hypnosis tactics that Donald Trump plays, and like having very simplistic phrases and words that he just like repeats over and over and over, and it puts you in the state of hypnosis because you become so familiar with what he's going to say that you tend to just like subconsciously agree with him just because it's so simple, and you don't really understand why. And his power, he understood how to hijack social media very fast. Also, again, with the simplistic phrasing, and that he understood that the news cycle could be, the 24-hour news cycle was much more defined on social media. Like before social media, the news cycle was generally 24 hours, but on social media, it's like every hour, every 1 hour. So if he wanted to divert attention somewhere, all he had to do was send out a tweet, even if it's just like completely unrelated to what he wants, to kind of divert attention. So a tactic he used to do all the time was when he was about to pass some sort of law or regulation or issue an executive order, he would tweet out something around the same time that's completely unrelated to the executive order. Now people are focused on like his misspelling of coffee or whoever he's bashing and attacking on social media. And that's what I found interesting. And that book kind of helped me understand who he was, and that he's a very, I won't say he's a manipulator, maybe in a sense, but he's highly persuasive because of that power that he possesses.
Yeah. Hearing you talk reminds me of decision-making research and models. And one of the takeaways is that we like our worlds to be simple. And so when people express themselves in ways that are cognitively complex and taxing for our brains, we naturally will turn away because we have limited information processing capabilities. So it sounds like his communication style really plays into giving people sound bites, for lack of a better phrase, that resonates with their belief system that they can hold on to and repeat. I mean, it's almost like building a brand and marketing effectively in a way. There's a professor named Robert Cialdini. He's considered the thought leader on persuasion. He has a couple of books. I recommend your listeners check out what he talks about. He goes through different principles of persuasion. One of my favorites is that if you can get people to write down a commitment, it often helps them follow through on that. So it sounds like Trump was using some of the persuasion, I think, research and science in ways he may not even have known.
Yeah. Are there any other leaders that you find very fascinating in terms of how they represent power or leadership?
Yes. My favorite leader of all time is in Vegas. His name is Eric Nixick. Shout out to Eric. He's an amazing leader, human being, and man. Eric is the manager of Randy Couture's Extreme Couture Gym, and he was recently awarded MMA Coach of the Year. He coached Francis Ngannou. Eric has come to my leadership class as a guest speaker for, I think, a year and a half plus. He is always so real and down to earth about how he leads the gym, how he coaches his fighters. One of my favorite learnings from him is that fighters are motivated usually by three factors, whether they're competitors, whether they're athletes, or whether they're fighters. And so competitors want to win. Athletes are the ones that you can give drills to and they fall into line pretty quickly. Fighters are the guys, because it is mostly male, but of course not, only male. But these are the guys that grew up with, they were burned by, their parents with cigarettes and abused. So they want to kill people when they get into the cage. And Eric talks a lot about how much investment he puts in his fighters to understand what motivates them. And I always generalize this to corporate America and tell leaders, it's so important that you take the time to understand what motivates your employees. Don't lead with the assumption that what motivates you is what motivates them. And people are motivated by money, but that's not the only thing that they're motivated by. There's actually research, by the way, showing that if you give people a pay raise, that will in the short run make them motivated, but then they go back to being unmotivated because of other reasons, including relationships with their leaders, the working conditions, and so forth. Eric has my utmost respect for how he, again, is a leader in his community. He's also shared with my students the importance of vulnerability, and he tries to model this with his fighters. And he himself calls the fighters, we're a bunch of Neanderthals. There's a bunch of alpha dudes sitting around. Everyone's beating the shit out of each other, right? Like it's literally blood, sweat, and tears. But he talks about when he's in his circles with his fighters at the end of a practice, he will initiate being vulnerable himself. And he finds that role modeling opens up space for these fighters to talk about their trauma, because they often have come from pretty hard life circumstances. And Eric keeps it real. He always credits his wife, his mother, his children, his community. And it's an honor to know him, because I feel like his career is only going to blow up even more than it already has. And he really signals to people what's important in life. Another story he shared is that despite whether it's a victory or a loss, he thinks about it for 24 hours and then he moves on. And even though if Francis Ngannou has won, Eric moves on to the next fighter who warrants his attention the next day because he has a coaching relationship with that fighter. The last takeaway that Eric has talked about, which has stayed with me, is how selective he's becoming in terms of where he gives his time. And of course, the more successful you become in your career, you can be more choosy. But for Eric, that decision is often driven by values and whether or not the person, the fighter, the coach that wants to work with him shares the same values as he does. You know, it could be something as simple as what kind of branding are they putting out on social media. So I cannot say enough good things about Eric and the role model he is for my students as a man in a masculine community. I mean, the fight game, right? Where can you find more masculinity? And again, I have met corporate leaders of all types, and I think Eric is the foremost teacher on leadership that I've ever encountered.
Wow. So would you say selflessness is one of the most important traits to possess as a formidable leader?
Absolutely. So because I study the intersection of power and leadership, I study empowering leadership. It's when leaders delegate to employees, when they are willing to, let employees make decisions, take accountability for their work. I'll qualify this by saying you obviously don't hand over the riskiest, most visible decision-making to your employees. But when I used to travel a lot before COVID, I'd often sit next to executives on planes and whatever section of the plane I was on. I don't always like travel first, let's be clear. But executives would say to me, what's your belief system about leadership? And I said, the best leaders are those who actually become invisible, where it comes to the point where your employees are running your company, where you're not threatened if your employees are promoted either within your company or leave to work in a different sector or pursue graduate school. That's a testament to you as a leader. If your employees are becoming brighter and more skilled and more talented, I think leaders often get threatened, right? When they think about other employees, getting promoted or whether or not they'll replace the leader. But to me, the best leaders are those who are focused on others and realize that selflessness is actually how you become a more powerful leader. Because back to our earlier conversation, when you're investing in others as a leader and you're not being selfless, you're developing social equity. You're developing relationship capital. One of my friends, Christopher Goss, works for Losers Bar. He's a vice president of operations. And I'm stunned by how much Christopher invests in his employees. He will ask them, what are your career goals? Do you want to become a manager? Then let's put you on a management track. Are you doing this to help you pay for graduate school? Let's talk about that. So I think the selflessness is embedded in the very essence of what leaders do. And again, because I study power, I'm not impressed by leaders who hoard power or think they only have to be about themselves. That's not the way the world works, or it shouldn't be, in my opinion.
Yeah. Somebody who is really good at this also lived in Vegas for a long time, RIP Tony Hseih, his book, Delivering Happiness. I guess he was one of the forefront of how to build culture and how his office was like in the middle of just one of the normalized floors within all the employees.
Yeah.
And how he threw parties with everybody and never referred to himself really as a CEO. Like, he demonstrated like a lot of the things that you're speaking on. I mean, he even lived at Ferguson's for years. And there's so funny, people would tweet pictures out on, I call it Vegas Twitter, of Tony Hseih just like walking around downtown. Like, you just see this billionaire walking around, but you would have no idea.
Yeah.
No idea. They don't let wealth or status define who they are. They seem to demonstrate the exact personality through the entirety of their life.
And he's a great example of someone who had power and wealth, and he became more of who he was, which was focused on his community. And that can be broadly defined, the community he served. I had the opportunity to tour the Zappos campus pre-COVID and also to attend a Zappos all hands meeting. It was probably 4 to 5 hours. It was one of the most stimulating and draining experiences I've ever had because it was such an emotional ride to be in that environment. Tony came out at the start of the meeting, spoke for a few minutes, and it was like you were talking to your neighbor, right? Listening to him speak about kind of the current state of the company. At that time, Zappos was actually going to be training a subsector, he said, of Amazon employees on the Zappos culture so that culture could spread throughout Amazon down the line. We also do case studies in my classes on Zappos, and they're known for, holacracy, which was Tony's kind of idea. It's a decentralized organization. Power is very much shared according to kind of the reports we hear. And for my students, they're actually required to call the Zappos customer loyalty team hotline. And they're tasked with asking the employees on this CLT, why do you work for Zappos? What do you like about the culture? And it's certainly a unique place, I think, and sort of a company we hold up in the management world of doing things right in many ways by their staff. There was an employee at Zappos who told me when I was there for the tour, he had back surgery, which I think cost in the upward of $300,000. And his bill, because of the benefits and Tony Hseih, was maybe $500.
Wow. R.I.P. to him. He definitely had a huge impact on Vegas in a sense. That's also, he demonstrated, I read his book recently, right after he passed away. He was my number one person that I wanted to talk to on the podcast when I first started. But he demonstrated something to me of almost a contrarian view, where he came down and moved his whole entire office out to Vegas, like in downtown, when downtown was like nothing. And he just consistently believed in his own mission, no matter what people told him, if it wouldn't work, if it didn't work. I forget his ad business, which he made a lot of money off in the beginning. He is like a purebred leader who had a lot of power and wanted to do good with it.
Agreed.
And I think that idea has begun to trickle down to a lot of the younger generations as well. You don't necessarily need money, but he was leading his vision with an idea to build culture, but also to have some sort of social impact on what he was doing as well.
Agreed. I mean, I think it's so important for us in our lives to have a wider lens beyond ourselves. And he embodied that in Vegas and around the world with the investments he made. So I always encourage leaders to think more broadly, to understand again that when you invest in other people, you're actually helping yourself at the end of the day, and it's going to benefit your career.
Throughout your research, have you seen a change in power dynamics or leadership that's demonstrated over maybe the last 30 years or 40 years? Is there any noticeable change that you see?
Yeah, I think really we're moving away from, older school thinking around leadership and topics like motivation. So, back in the day, people would use carrot and stick approaches. They would be much more micromanaging. And I feel like we're moving into a different era where leaders are starting to understand that empowering their employees benefits the leaders, the employees, and their organizations. And I like to say that there's a little bit of a loosening of the tight grip that leaders will have on their organizations and employees. I'm sure some of your listeners work for leaders who are micromanagers, but the research is suggesting that that's antiquated. It doesn't produce more profit. It doesn't make for more engaged or satisfied employees. And in some ways, it's more stressful, right, for leaders to clamp down. And following Zappos, I think some organizations are starting to understand the benefits of this loosening up again. You can still have job titles. You can still have reporting relationships, but really trying to lead your people in a way where you're not their professional parent, I think is where the research has led us. And I always like to say that the way you lead is often a reflection of how secure you are in your own self. And so if leaders aren't comfortable empowering employees, there might be an opportunity for you to step back and think about why. And, there's also research, for example, on attachment theory, which we've talked a little bit about. It's the idea that your relationship with your primary caretaker influences every personal and professional relationship in your life. So I'm a big proponent of leaders in this day and age to really step back and again, reflect on what are some of their mental models or assumptions about having relationships with other people. Attachment theory suggests you either have a secure, anxious, or avoidant attachment style. And the idea is that based on different research by psychologists, if I have a baby and I leave the room and I come back, a baby might check in with me and then go back to playing. That's a secure attachment style. A baby might, freak out because I left. And then when I come back, cling and scream and cry and need my attention. That's an anxious attachment style. And then an avoidant attachment style is when mom leaves, you come back and the baby acts like nothing is wrong. The fascinating part about this research, and again, there's implications for leadership, is that people with an avoidant attachment style, and in the baby's research, the babies actually had a higher physiological response in terms of their stress. So they were the most stressed out of the three babies, but they acted like it was no big deal. And there's leadership research that says avoidant leaders don't like to talk about their feelings. They don't like to talk about their emotions. They're not relationship oriented. They're very much about tasks and getting the work done. Leadership, by definition, is a social influence process. If you're not building relationships, you're probably not an effective leader. And then, the interesting part is that anxious and avoidant attachment styles, some people say, are on a spectrum of insecurity. And it's really about whether or not you feel like you can count on people to show up for you. Do you expect support and that it will be there? Do you feel safe in exploring new ideas, new activities? Are you more defensive? In the, personal dating realm, avoidants tend to make a long list of all the disadvantages of being in a relationship. It's really speaking to their attachment style, that they don't feel comfortable leaning in and having real intimacy with people. And again, this all carries over into the leadership research. So the trends in research are, learn how to empower your employees, learn to do that work internally so you feel secure with that. And then hopefully that will optimize your leadership and it'll help you, your employees, and your organization.
Wow. Do you think this trending leadership style will be able to translate over to this new trend of remote working where you're not in the building with your employees? I'm sure you have to kind of navigate that in a different way.
So this is a really timely question because literally half an hour before I came to do the podcast, I just had a research paper accepted for publication, and the title is Why Leaders Resist Empowering Virtual Employees. And so we talk about three themes in the research, which is some leaders are not motivated to lead. And when they're in a virtual setting, they're so stressed out that lack of motivation gets exacerbated. A second perspective is that it's risky to empower your employees. If you give up what you perceive as control and your employees make errors, you're accountable as a leader. And in the virtual space, it's harder to track what your employees are doing. You're not having those quote unquote natural collusions. If you were in the same office space, you just don't know, right? Like the status of projects and so forth. It's a lot harder to acquire information and communicate virtually. So motivation and risk tend to deter leaders from empowering remote employees. And then the last perspective is control. Some leaders don't feel comfortable giving up control because they think that they are the drivers of what happens in their life. And if they share power with their employees, they're losing control. And so what we actually recommend is that organizations analytically think about what stressors for remote work could make leaders from a motivation, risk, and control perspective more likely to not empower. And so one example that we've learned, it's actually from a gaming executive here in town that I was fortunate enough to interview for this project. The executive talks about this philosophy called get me, guide me, root for me. And what he does when everything went online is he will meet with his employees and it's 10 minutes on their calendar. And he said to us, it's 9 minutes of listening. And so essentially what he does is he tries to understand where the employees are at with their work and their lives. That's get me. Then he tries to give them training or development. That's guide me. And then root for me is what he calls being a cheerleader. Can you imagine talking to your manager for 9 minutes, like how heard you would feel? And in turn, the executive feels more comfortable empowering his remote workers because he knows where they stand, where they're at, what are their challenges, what are their, sort of opportunities. It was brilliant when he told us this term GGR, modeled after gross gaming revenue, if I'm not mistaken, the industry term. So I think the virtual space is bringing to the surface what we know about leadership anyway, motivation, risk, and control perspectives, and is giving organizations an opportunity, again, to think about how can we dial down some of the stressors of working remotely and help our leaders empower.
Wow. In the remote working too, I've found one of the benefits, at least from my friends that have transitioned to remote work full time, is that they seem much happier because they don't have to spend time commuting to work. They're saving an hour, 2 hours a day from getting ready to driving to having to, prep their meal and bring it into work. And so I think it seems like there would be a much more natural relationship, or like it's not as much of like a give and pull kind of thing because they're willing to work with their manager or their leader because of the new benefits that they've found in this position they're in.
I agree. UNLV, as of July 1st, is bringing back staff on campus. And in the fall, we're supposed to be in person. I think we'll still wait and see how the summer goes. But I predict there's going to be fatigue because people have to commute. They have to deal with traffic. The stimuli of being just around a lot of other people is taxing, especially if you're introverted like I am. And I think really the best model from my perspective, and this will vary by job and industry, like frontline workers can't do what I'm about to say, but I'm starting to hear dialogue in academia to encourage organizations to adopt hybrid models where there's some FaceTime in the office, but then you're also allowing employees to work from home. My philosophy in life is we often approach decisions with a binary lens. It either has to be this or it either has to be that. You're either in the office or either you're remote. I actually think the flexibility and the freedom, going back to my interest in agency, is where you can find models that are blended, or you think more creatively about problem solving, and you may not have to hold hard and fast to either being completely virtual or completely in person. And I challenge leaders to think with a broader lens and try to make situations, again, win-win. And that's how you build engagement and commitment. If you're showing your employees that you're trying to work with them, that you're honoring fatigue from commuting or the extra time that they have to build in now to prep their meals, I mean, the best leaders are the best listeners at the end of the day, in my opinion. And that's how you problem solve. That's how you collect information. I think some leaders are just so focused on the tasks and getting through the work. But in any relationship, listening and understanding the other party's interests is actually the starting point.
Yeah, I've always lived with the firm belief that in order to be understood, you must first understand. So you have to understand who's across from you, and then therefore they'll give you their time to understand who you are.
100%. And if you think about the definition of power, again, enforcing your will over others, you can do that effectively when you understand what the other person's needs are.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this new trend, or maybe the hybrid model, is going to affect academia or you as a leader and an educator?
I get asked this a lot. So my classes will be in person in the fall. This past academic year, 3 of my 4 classes were in person. So for me, I'm still accustomed to that experience, which I highly prefer over online teaching. My understanding is that the majority of the university will be back in person, but the university is experimenting with some hybrid teaching opportunities. So I do have a few colleagues in the management information system side of my department, MIS, who will be teaching online. And again, I think there's opportunity, right? Like as an organization, universities can survey their landscape, try to understand the needs of their base, the students, and then, see if they can meet those needs. And I think UNLV tries to do this. Like we have a part-time MBA program that's at night because people often work full-time during the day. So I'm curious to see where UNLV can understand and then leverage and optimize, right, the opportunities that are out there. I think in higher education, the online experience is it's different, right, than in person. And I think as an educator, for me, the best experience tends to be face-to-face. I teach about topics that are often discussion-oriented. So the online space just doesn't replicate what happens in the classroom. There are maybe some content areas, like my MIS colleagues can probably speak to teaching what they do online more effectively. But at the end of the day, it's funny. So Seth Shore, who's a property CEO here in town, he was a guest speaker in my power class, and he said, technology and social media will never replace the essence of business, which is relationships. And that often involves in-person interaction. So I'm curious where higher education will go. I'm hopeful, again, that some online opportunities will be there and the offerings will meet students' needs. But I still believe the impact really happens in the classroom. I learn from my students every semester, and we always talk about rappers and they call my music taste straight gutter, which is such a compliment. But that just doesn't happen online the way it does when we're in the classroom together.
Yeah, I think the universities are in between a rock and a hard place, because if you do transition to completely remote, a lot of the students will stop coming because they could just get that information online for free. And also you kill campus life, right? What about all of the fraternities and sororities and the student sections that need to be filled at the sports games? Like there's a lot of things outside of just the classroom that need to be fulfilled with in-person attendance. But now we've been in this remote work environment for a year, and all of the traditional habits have been broken and new habits have been formed, and some new students may feel resistant towards it. Or let's say the kids who are in middle school or high school now that got used to it and don't want to go in person. So they kind of, like I said, they're in between a rock and a hard place, because it's almost like a lose-lose no matter which direction you take. But with the increasing tuition rate that just keeps increasing, it's just pushing more kids out of that basket that may attend.
I think those are all fair points. I mean, I hear from students occasionally, they prefer online. They can watch, the asynchronous lectures their professors have recorded. And some of that teaching is, again, for different content areas where online might be a better fit. But to your point, campuses are dynamic communities. And there was a podcast that NPR did several years ago on the campus culture at UNLV, or the lack thereof at that time. And I have my students listen to that as part of our class on culture in Zappos. And to me, community is what sustains us. It's what energizes us. It's why so many people struggled during lockdown when we weren't having that contact. And I feel like the branding and just the work that universities do would change tremendously if we went entirely remote. And I mean, to me, when you're at an event and you feel that energy or you're wearing UNLV paraphernalia, it makes you feel part of something larger than yourself. And I think that's important. And it's that social kind of connection is what makes our lives so much richer.
Yeah. Vegas is a highly commuter school. I think it's like 75% of the students are locals. I was in Greek life for 5 years there. I was heavily involved in the campus life, going to all the basketball games, the football games, participating in philanthropies and all that stuff. It really helped define who I am today, just because of the social connections that you make, especially in a town that is built on social connections, right?
Exactly.
I make this joke all the time that the nightlife is just an extension of Greek life. There's so many similarities between how fraternities and sororities interact, between how the bussers and the servers interact, and how the hosts interact with the servers. It's almost just like a grown-up version of the Greek life. And so with fraternities more specifically, you're able to practice a lot of the organizational skills and leadership qualities that you possess. And then after you've gone through it for so many semesters, you take that into whatever endeavor you're doing, and it just seems like a natural fit, but you don't realize like you've been practicing that for years and years into the success that you find yourself in.
You might be interested in these 3 concepts from the social networks research called strong, dormant, and weak ties. So strong ties are your familiar others, your top 5 people you interact with, people you go to for advice who make you feel comfortable and supported. You can trust them. The social networks research suggests those people are often demographically like you. They grew up like you, talk like you, similar backgrounds, similar majors if you pursued college. And there's benefits, right, to have those familiar others. Dormant ties are ties that actually fell asleep, and they're formerly strong ties that for some not bad reason just drifted away. So this could be someone you grew up with in your childhood, an old professor, an old coworker. And then weak ties are people you don't really interact with who are more diverse. And so the social networks research says from a relationship perspective and to build social equity, you should try to awaken a dormant tie. So I have colleagues who have it in their calendar every month. They'll hit someone up that they used to be tight with and they rebuild that relationship. And there's, I think, plentiful opportunities in Vegas to awaken your weak ties, your dormant ties, And then we always encourage people to step out of your comfort zones and build weak ties. Talk to people you wouldn't normally speak to. Ask them to have coffee or go out or have informational interviews, because weak ties often have non-overlapping information and experiences. But we're so pulled towards our comfort zones and being with people we already know that we vibe with. But really, it's awakening those dormant ties and trying to cultivate weak ties in a small town like Vegas, where I think you build that relational capital.
Yeah, 100%. And the campus life it's again a fictitious reality, right? It's like you're not in the real world, but you're able to get away with more things because you're almost treated still like a young adult, even though you are an adult.
Yeah.
But for me personally, like I went to UNLV for kinesiology, graduated with a kinesiology degree, never used that professionally. And after about, I would say going into my junior year of college, I was like, okay, I'm probably not going to use this degree professionally. But I realized being a part of this campus life is doing for me and like building these connections. And that was like one of my light bulb moments where I was like, okay, I'm going to continue to just build relationships because I'm not going to get this moment back ever. And this experience is it's a very curated experience where you are investing social equity in all of these relationships that you're building. And you never know how those like dormant relationships are going to come back down the road. And that has happened a handful of times where you meet somebody in college, you don't talk with them for 3, 4, 5 years, and then you run into them on the strip and they're your manager or they're hiring you or they're a referral. And so those come back to play a lot. And
for sure.
And to get rid of something like that, I think it would just be so detrimental to not just like the university model, but for the UNLV model as well.
Yeah. The more I learn about your story, the more I can admire and appreciate the proactivity with which you make choices, because relationships don't develop if you're sitting at home. You have to put yourself out there. And it can be a little bit unnerving, and there's not, again, necessarily a guaranteed positive outcome. But power and influence and capital, these all happen when you are trying to talk with people and to, explain who you are and get to know yourself and get to know them. So I encourage people to get off their phones and go out into your communities and into settings where relationships that you wouldn't probably explore could be available to you. That's how you grow. That's how you become happy and successful. And I think all the important markers we have in our lives.
Yeah. I used to always have this example when you're in Greek life, and you're a brother, usually whoever's rushing the fraternity like interviews you. And so I used to always use this example of going down this yellow brick road of your personal bubble, right? Where you feel most comfortable with. And in order to progress, to get into that forest and then all the way to the Wizard of Oz, you have to continually step out of your comfort bubble. But then you realize once you're walking down this path that this comfort bubble still protects you. And so eventually you get to the end where you've gone down all of these like scary, dark places, and now you're back in your comfort bubble, but you're literally miles down the road. And so these uncomfortable things that you used to possess are now just comfortable to you. And so you just continually grow in that way.
I love that. One area of my research is on post-traumatic growth. It's the idea that after trauma, you can grow. And people often confuse post-traumatic growth and resilience. And in very simplified language, resilience is when you bounce back to what you knew. Post-traumatic growth is where you bounce forward because you can never go back. Resilience is often defined as being resistant to adversity. And again, you can kind of, resume the normal that you had after a hardship. But with trauma, your world completely shatters. And we've experienced this collectively in a number of ways. People have trauma from their childhoods, hearkening back to the attachment theory content. And I always like to tell people, if you've been through something that broke your world, and you and I have both, I think, had this experience in our life, that becomes a catalyst where you can then move forward and rebuild your belief system, where you can recreate your life in ways that are actually going to serve you and help you become fulfilled and to help you find your pack. I have dogs, so I don't use the word tribe. I think pack is much more fitting. And I commend you for demonstrating growth in the face of hardship, because I think growth and leaving your comfort zone are correlated. And I'm constantly looking to grow. So I work with a trainer at VVV CrossFit, Brian Blessing. And last fall I told Blessing, I said, I want to learn something new every week. And my friends were like, only you would say in a private training session. But Blessing has killed it. He's exceeded it, actually. So it's nourishing for me to hear you talk, because I think that growth is actually what makes us better people, and it makes our lives so much more interesting.
So much more fulfilling. Yeah, I had a woman on here about a year ago. I think she was like episode 28. Her name's Anne Bernard. She runs a company called 365 Firsts, and it's all about going through first-time experiences and how going through something for the first time rewires your brain and has to deal with like neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
And how once you go through all of these different first-time experiences, your brain, it does something on this like subconscious level where it understands how to interact with first-time experiences, but is aware that it is a first-time experience, so that it does have an effect on your brain. It's such an interesting business that I think you'd enjoy that episode for sure.
I'll check it out. Neuroplasticity is discussed quite a bit in the trauma research. So if you grew up in an environment with trauma, let's take abuse or neglect as an example, having relationships where you curate safety and security and stability helps your brain rewrite those scripts, because trauma often takes over the brain and assumes the same script will play out. I also call it like a record that plays, and your brain sinks into those same grooves of abandonment and rejection. But when you have new first experiences where relationships are more positive and healthy, you're learning almost a new habit of how you interact with people. And if anyone who's listening has been through trauma, rest assured the brain is plastic and flexible, and you can actually train your brain to rewrite those scripts in ways that can serve you.
You can always make a change. Sometimes it's hard to contrive that energy to do that kind of thing. Sometimes we just need a kick in the ass from one of our friends, or sometimes we need to realize that we're going down the wrong path, or that we're in a state of complacency. Sometimes it's hard to realize that, but I think surrounding yourself with like a good circle will help prevent that and encourage you to do things in life that'll increase that neuroplastic mind to conform yourself to a better version of you.
Yeah. And sometimes life kicks you in the ass and your body cries out and warrants the attention that it deserves. So there can be a lot of motivations, I think, to make better choices for yourself.
Yeah.
You know, I've been thinking a lot lately about self-respect, and I'm always struck at the signals we send other people in terms of how we treat ourselves. And these choices that we're talking about, I think at the end of the day, signal how much we value our own selves. And unless you value your own self and unless you choose you, how do you expect others to treat you in kind?
Yeah. I see some of this like lowered self-esteem or like selfless respect, I guess would be the right word, in the industry. And that was one of the reasons, again, why I ended up leaving, is that you become so, you almost conform to this, I'm speaking just on nightclubs, but day clubs as well, and some of the other positions where you're making like a decent amount of money and you become complacent because you want to leave this industry, right? Like if you're working a graveyard shift, you're fighting against your biological clock. You're working literally 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. You develop insomnia. That's like an unspoken thing that happens that almost every single person develops. That's why a lot of people take pills to go to bed or drink before they go to bed or smoke weed to kind of, stay asleep until you wake up at 2, 3 o'clock. And so everyone always wants to eventually leave the industry, but nobody ever does because they're making like a good amount of money. But they also realize that they're stuck. It's almost like this catch-22, which I see. And a lot of people in the industry do possess this like, I don't know, demeaning view of themselves where like, they're all surrounded by supermodels, right? Bussers, bartenders, servers, but a lot of them don't respect themselves that much. It's such this like weird, fascinating culture where it's like everyone's making a lot of money. Everyone superficially looks beautiful, but internally a lot of people are hurting and that they want to get out, but they never leave because of the money. It's almost like a self-fulfilling thing.
Yeah. The phrase golden handcuffs has been told to me about the industry and how people want to release those handcuffs, but they don't feel like they have choice or agency to do so. I mean, you can speak to this a lot better than I can since I'm not embedded in the industry. And again, my job is not to evaluate anyone's choices. Something I encourage people to think about is, what do you value the most or what's important to you? And if at some point the choices you're making professionally don't coincide with your value system, maybe money stops being the most important priority for you. Like maybe a healthy lifestyle or having a relationship with someone where there's commitment and monogamy, right? You've told me stories about how common infidelity or hooking up are. Jobs that cause you pain are actually, I think, mirrors in a lot of ways. And I think it's easy in different industries. This is not unique to the Strip. Investment banking is actually another industry I've heard a lot about where people work 17 hours, 6 days a week, and they make $250,000 and they sell their souls because that's a lot of money. And you can't really have a life outside of that. But at some point, maybe you reach, like a turning point where you realize that money isn't everything. Maybe it's a short-term resource that you need. And, if you've grown up in hard times and you didn't have access to money, maybe there's draw in these types of industries. It's just not going to sustainably allow you to live, I think, a healthy lifestyle from the stories I'm told, again, from some of these choices that people have.
Yeah. Jen T, who I had on the podcast, she worked in investment banking on Wall Street for 30 years. And a phrase that stuck out to me always, which I think about, is she said that she had to put herself on autopilot to work because, again, she felt very like soulless. And then when she moved out to Vegas, she started a massage therapy company. And I was like, oh, it's kind of funny. You're like, you're going through 30 years of investment banking where you were on autopilot. And so then the next thing you want to do is you want to find this nourishing business where you're going through massage therapy and it's very like soulful and sensual because it was the complete opposite of what you were practicing for so many years.
And her massage business probably thrives because she can understand the stress that her clients bring in. I was at the foundation room last weekend. I told you I had one drink and I broke a water glass. That was not me in college.
Vegas is back.
And I was talking to one of their security guards, and he told me he worked in the industry for 10 years. He worked at day clubs and then would transition to nightclubs. And the first comment I said to him is, you must have infinite patience to deal with people. And he said, yeah. He said, to be frank, I feel like I've developed another layer or level of patience. And then he looked straight at me, and I'm a qualitative researcher, so I talk to everybody. It's really annoying if you're in an Uber with me, because I'm always like to the driver, how do you like Uber? What drew you to this? I get high customer ratings though. But the security guard talked about how he has become numb to human behavior and the worst, right, that he's seen. He also shared with me about how when altercations happen or tensions start to rise, he tries to explain to guests that he's there to work with them. He doesn't want to kick them out. He wants them to stay and buy alcohol. But when he used the word numb, that to me sounded like a coping mechanism.
I can identify with that for sure. There's a lot of things that you see working on the Strip. I worked at a pool for 5 years, but even before the nightclub. So I was literally on the Strip for 10 years. You do develop this sort of patience. I think it depends on the perspective that you shine with it. You tend to see a lot of the awesome sides of people, but you also like to hear a lot of the more criminal behavior, or like their true quote unquote freeing selves, right? When everyone wants to come out to Vegas and just unleash and let loose. My numbing agent to me more was, I say that working on the Strip makes you desensitized to, sexuality in a sense. It made me feel almost like very superficial, because I'm surrounded by all these like beautiful women. But then a lot of these women have like very perfect features. And so you tend to, like, when you communicate with someone even outside the industry or in, you tend to judge them really fast, even though you don't want to, just because you're surrounded by this like quote unquote perfection. Like, so, that was my like numbness, was that it made me numb to beautiful people for a long time, because I was just surrounded by it for so long. You don't really understand what it's like to be outside of it.
It was your normal. And then I have a question, if you're comfortable answering. How do you now view women? Like where has your perspective shifted? Do you place a different value or emphasis on the non-physical features?
Yeah. So for me, I think I've always been attracted to like intellect more so than anything. And I think that's been a little bit more exuded now that I've been out it for, I guess we'll say a year. I officially quit a month ago, but I haven't worked in it for a year because of the pandemic. And so I haven't been putting as much of a premium on superficiality as I once was a few years ago, which is awesome. It feels like a relief almost that you're not in that environment, because there's such an importance on how you present yourself, or at least how you look. And the people who work in the industry tend to take a hit in their internal feelings and their confidence. Whereas now when you're out in the real world, I guess outside of the Strip, it's almost flipped now, where it's like, obviously there's an importance on how you look, but there's more of an importance on how you present yourself, and are you intellectual and things of that nature. So yeah, it's almost flipped.
One other question I have for you, this is again to help me as an outsider to the Strip do some sense making. Who you were when you worked on the Strip, that's still you, right? Like that's still the real Jake. And now who you are is you. So how do you reconcile? It's not like there's two different selves. I'm not trying to imply that you were person A back then and now you're person B. I feel like when people are working on the Strip, and we think back to our earlier conversation about power and wealth, does working on the Strip bring out genuinely what you value and consider, which could be physical attractiveness? And then now do you have like a more expanded view and you're attracted to intellect? Does that make sense? So one of the reasons I ask is, in research, we talk about emotional labor, which is where you pretend to be happy or you lead with a certain emotion that's not actually how you feel. In customer service, we do this a lot. Teachers do it a lot. Like you can be having a bad day. It doesn't matter, right? You're focused on your customer. So I'm just curious how you reconcile the Jake back then with the Jake today.
Yeah. So that is also like a running joke, is that a lot of people who work in the industry, you do develop a second identity because of the glamour that's presented and the importance of how much money do you have, or who are you connected with? Like I like to call Vegas the name drop economy. When you walk up to a club and you're like, oh, I know Bob, who's the manager. They're like, oh, come on in. But like they'll question everything about it until you name drop somebody. And that like close association is very important and travels very far. And so you kind of lose your self identity when you're working on the strip for so long. And then like when the strip closed down, right, we were making a joke in the Buster chat of like, I wonder what servers are doing so terrible during the pandemic because they have to live with their true identity, and their ego isn't inflated. And this is also for busters too and other people, but they're so heavily involved in the industry that they don't know what it's like to exist outside of the industry because of all the attention and the bottle service and the glamour every time you go into a nightclub or a day club or a bar or anything like that, where all the attention is kind of thrown at you. And now outside of the strip, no one knows who you are. And so it's almost like a celebrity who's kind of fallen from grace. Yeah. And they're all of a sudden they were an A-class celebrity. And now they're like D, C list. And they just like, they don't know how to present themselves. It's very similar on the strip.
That's, again, really interesting. It sounds like you're a more integrated Jake Gallen. Like, you know, more fully and richly who you are in these different layers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a heavily layered society in Vegas. But I enjoy doing this podcast now because I get to see the layers outside of the strip. And I knew that the layers existed. I just didn't have a tool to connect to it. But now the podcast makes it easier to connect with those layers and show that, you know, Vegas is more than just the strip, as many people, you know, are led to believe. But it's a really cool integrated project. Yeah, I guess now I get to tap into that life that existed for 10 years on the strip, and now I get to take that perspective and put it to use out here in the real world.
You're very good at being my personal tour guide, by the way, for the strip. So thank you, because the way you talk and the way you describe your experiences, from the language you use, just to the way you articulate what it was like to work on the strip, I think you have a skill in helping people inside and outside of the strip, again, make sense of what that experience looks like. I mean, I told you I listened to episode 0 and it helped me just geographically understand Vegas. And I've lived here for almost 3 years, and I've actually driven, I think, in more parts of it than most locals, I'm told, because on the East Coast, driving more than 20 minutes is that's considered a blessing, right? Here, it's like a long way, I know, to go. So yeah, I support and encourage the work that you do to be this, you know, sense maker and tour guide for those who live here and those like me who live here and are trying to understand it.
I appreciate that. Yeah, that's where I gain a lot of gratification for, and having very awesome conversations like this.
Yeah.
It's been so enlightening, so informing. Literally, it's been an hour and a half. Just like flown by. Before we do get out of here, I do have one final question for you.
Sure.
Same question I ask everybody. What does Las Vegas mean to you?
Wow, that's a great question. Las Vegas to me is a diamond in the rough. It's a gem of a town and a community, a center of business and education. It's also starting to mean home to me, which is the first time I think publicly I've said that. It's such a unique place to live and to work. And I feel like there's greater levels of appreciation from people outside of Vegas of what it means to be here. And I'm proud and, again, honored to be a resident, a member of the UNLV community, and I can't wait to see where our town goes. I loved when I moved here that people would say to me, what side of town do you live on? And, you know, I know we're a town of about 2 million, and to be in a place where there's such growth and there's already a foundation that we're building on, I don't think I could have asked for a better place to call home.
Oh, it's so beautiful. Where do I send all the listeners and viewers to follow you, learn more about your work?
Yeah, they can check out my website. It's power.faculty.unlv.edu. There's podcasts I've done, resources, my research publications, my contact information is there, and I would love to stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Payal, thank you so much for this conversation. It's lived up to everything that I expected. I know we'll be in contact even after this. We'll probably sit here and talk for another hour. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge and insight with all of us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you guys for listening, and we'll catch you next time.